Let's start the second part of our interview with our guest today, Simon Dalby. We will speak about the complex relations between borders and climate change. In this second part, we will think about future scenarios in a climate-disrupted world and how to prepare for climate challenges. My first question, Simon, is this one. Some regions face escalating ecological and social challenges due to climate change, including habitat loss, economic disruption, and population displacement. What future scenarios do you envision for regions repeatedly affected by wildfires, and how might these scenarios reshape border dynamics and migration patterns? Hard questions and large questions, but
well, I mean, again, this is one of these big questions we simply have to figure out how to start to grapple with.
Yeah.
We usually think about migration and climate in terms of the global south, where populations will be removed as desertification and so on, drying out farming. Conditions may drive farmers into the cities and so on. But what happens if we think about climate migrants as the residents of those suburbs of Los Angeles that got burned earlier this year? What if we think about climate migrants as the population of the Northwest Territories, much of which was forced to move to Alberta and elsewhere in Canada as huge wildfires swept through them in it was the summer of 2023. I think. The point being that we are already in motion. Populations are already having to deal with wildfire. One of the most extraordinary events in Canadian history recently is already being forgotten. And that was the evacuation of Fort McMurray in 2016, the beast fire that burned part of the city. The extraordinary improvisation at the last minute, where a whole city was basically told to get in their cars and drive away and do so at short notice. What's extraordinary is only 2 people died in that because of actually a vehicle accident in the process. Instant emergency evacuations are something we are going to have to learn to get a lot better at. And the lesson to be learned from Fort McMurray is simply the speed at which that fire moved. That morning, on the crucial day, people were sort of looking at the sky thinking, there's a fire out of town, better keep an eye on that. And by the afternoon, everybody was frantically trying to contact their neighbors and their friends and pick up their kids and get the heck out of the city. It's quite an extraordinary emergency circumstance, and frankly, a lot of people got very lucky in terms of getting out alive from that one. Most of the climate change discussion, however, talks about much slower migration, people losing their livelihoods and being forced to move. The implication being that it'll be a crisis if those people actually have to move across borders, because it's the international migration has been the fear factor invoked in terms of trying to get people's attention on climate change, which may not actually get us the kind of policy responses we need in the present world of populist authoritarian politics, where strangers are seen as the threat rather than climate change. Then we're living in a world where this really needs to be thought about much more carefully. Some years ago, I looked at the figures in the World Bank study on climate migration in Africa. Much alarm about 50 million people were going to have to move. I think the figure was 50 million by the middle of the century. This was a couple of years ago. And that was likely to cause all sorts of chaos, wasn't it? And then I looked at the figures for urbanization, back to your point about cities in the first half of our podcast. And well, guess what? In Nigeria alone, that number of people were anticipated to move from the countryside into the cities. That's just one country of the 55 or 56, however many Africa has these days. The point being that we are migrating into cities anyway. Migration is part of the human condition, and recognizing that climate is part of what is causing migration would be a helpful. I can say that word eventually. Helpful corrective to the fear about migration as threat, which has been a not helpful part of the discussion about climate. There are some states that are particularly vulnerable to this. The case of Iraq, of course, gets a lot of people's attention because Iraq is drying out. It's dependent on fuel supplies from or money from the fuel in the oil supplies that it exports. It's subject, of course, to whatever the Turkish folks decide to allow to flow down the Tigris and the Euphrates for irrigation and so on. And it really is a hard case. What does that population do, dependent on oil revenues, if the world finally gets serious about climate change and reduces its demand for oil at the same time as agriculture becomes increasingly difficult as it dries out and irrigation water runs into short supply. Those are the kinds of situations that clearly need anticipation, particularly in the region. That oil money needs to be invested in thinking about new forms of agriculture, new forms of industry, new forms of keeping Baghdad and the other Iraqi cities functional. And we really do need to stop and think about those big issues. Or do we, at the last minute, come up with some kind of emergency migration measures to allow people to leave extreme environments? The situation in Gaza, as we speak, is not is not encouraging in that region because, for all sorts of good political reasons, the countries in the Middle East do not wish to accept Palestinian refugees caused by the Israeli invasion of Gaza. Is this a precedent that we are going to see where climate-induced refugees in Iraq or whatever down the road might pressure governments to take other forms of refugees? All of this stuff we need to stop and think very carefully about. The mostly people that are relocating to cities within the states that they're already citizens of. Beyond that, of course, there are the cases we mentioned earlier about low-lying island states in the Pacific and India, or in the Indian Ocean, where we need to think about where those people are going to go. But those are small populations, and that issue can be handled and probably will be handled by, in many cases, the New Zealand and Australian government simply accepting the populations from those island states, many of which already live in Australia and New Zealand anyway. But we do need to anticipate this. Governments need to think about how they build better cities far more sustainably, which will be able to accommodate people dispossessed from agriculture. And then we also need to think about how we do agriculture differently, perhaps in many cases closer to cities, to absorb that labor force that already has skills with plants and irrigation and harvesting and all the other things that agricultural workers know how to do. It requires thinking ahead, it requires planning, and it requires understanding that the circumstances of the future will be different from the circumstances of the past. That's the whole point of thinking intelligently about the Anthropocene as the new context for all of these things.
Thank you, Simon, for this great overview of the difficulties to anticipate with these future scenarios in the climate and disrupted world. During this podcast, Simon, we understood that climate impacts like wildfires demand proactive action to mitigate risks, to adapt to changes, and also to manage transboundary consequences. The next question asks for practical solutions. What recommendations would you offer governments to prepare for future climate impacts? You just spoke a bit about that in the last questions. But what could the government do practically to manage the issues and the consequences of this climate disrupted world we are going to live in more and more day after day?
Some of the answers we've already discussed, but there's lots of practical things in terms of city design, for instance. Thinking seriously about greening cities, quite literally having effective urban forests to provide shade and cooling and make city living more desirable. Really good when trees can actually, shade those cycle paths that we all are going to need to be using in future decades. Thinking about how we deal with very poor quality housing is something that is very much on Canadian minds these days. We need to build a lot more housing, but the lesson from the big heat dome in British Columbia a few years ago was that the people that are living in trailers and don't have air conditioning are far and away the most vulnerable. We need to stop and think about cooling centers, obviously, but we need to think intelligently about how to upgrade our housing stock, providing, in the British Columbia context, which was where we both are recording this conversation, making sure that there are grants for heat pumps, and it would be really nice if they came from some kind of a carbon tax, and that too is basically seems to be more or less abandoned by the current government. It's shifting the priorities away from fossil fuels, using fossil fuel revenue to build much more resilient and safer housing stock. Is a simple, practical way of protecting people from more serious climate impacts that are coming. We need to think in terms of practical issues about flood prevention. That was another lesson we learned a few years ago in British Columbia. The bridges that were washed out in the mountains were obviously not designed to deal with those huge floods that big rain event caused. We will be seeing more atmospheric rivers, undoubtedly. Predicting when and where they will hit, of course, is very, very tricky. But it's a reasonable guess that if you are building bridges, you need to be thinking about either making them much, much smaller so the floods just go right over them, or building them in ways that they will be better able to resist floodwaters. The idea of building bridges that are able to deal with small normal flows, but which are big floods simply wash right over, but leave intact. So you run a bulldozer across them as soon as the flood's gone and move the trees and debris off them, and then the road's open again, is the kind of innovative thinking that it's been done in many parts of the world, but it needs to be revived. We need to stop and think about, well, what can we live with a week of flood-closed roads? And hence, do we have larger food stocks in our cities so we're not dependent on trucks getting every day to keep us getting in every day? Building in that kind of resilience, that again requires talking to truckers and to folks that design roads and think seriously about infrastructure, so it can be temporarily interrupted, but will be intact once that temporary event has happened. That kind of philosophy is thinking about disruption quite literally, and how it is that we adapt to a more disrupted world means that we've got to be more resilient in terms of not depending on just-in-time deliveries for everything. We may need, better warehouses in our cities to have weeks of food supply rather than days. That does cause, of course, business plans for grocery chains would have to be rethought. The whole point about just-in-time delivery is it's supposedly cheaper because you don't have warehouse storage costs. You don't have to build warehouses. If the trucks keep coming every day, then you reduce the price of food because you don't have all of those infrastructure issues. Again, with food costs being an issue for substantial parts of our population these days, how do we tackle that? Making those food supplies more resilient and recognizing that the cost increases will have to be tackled, but the preparation to keep people safe so that food is available when the disruptions hit is good public policy. It's a common interest, a collective interest, which ought to be at the heart of security planning for any government that takes its responsibilities to its citizenry seriously. It's that kind of anticipatory thinking that is important. In terms of borders, well, obviously the lesson that we learned from those big floods in British Columbia a few years ago was the necessity of making it easy for the trucks that were diverted because the Coquihalla and the Trans-Canada were not available, actually allowing them easy transit through Washington State. People had to scramble to get those visas and travel document arrangements sorted out. It's easy, isn't it, to anticipate this sort of stuff. So if an emergency is declared in one jurisdiction, it triggers bureaucratic response in the border, across the border, to facilitate that kind of transit. That shouldn't be difficult to think through how to do it if we think about it. And of course, it's that anticipation, recognizing that disruptions are coming, and hence putting those kinds of measures in place so that we know what to do when the disruption happens. That's the kind of stuff that border management folks really need to stop and think about. And that requires cross-border dialogue and cooperation so that those arrangements are in place when needed, and there isn't a frantic scramble to try and get them organized at short notice, and panic and confusion adds to the difficulties of the disruption. If there's clear protocols in place, if people clearly know what they need to do when the disruption happens, then the disruption is far less difficult to handle, and a lot less suffering happens by the people caught in the way.
Thank you, Simon. As we know, and as we learn more in this podcast, climate change is already causing rising temperatures, extreme weather, sea level rise, and ecosystem shifts. Some people, some authors, politologues, or legal scholars speak about Earth governance, law of good neighborliness all around the world. Some other people speak about rewild the world or greening the economy. And some others speak about multi-level governance as a system which crosses legal or political or jurisdictional borders. And some others speak also about transnational relations. It means neither national, neither only international, but to integrate different actors with different status. So how might humanity adapt to a changing climate? That's a basic question, but it's an important one. And through which technological, political, or social, or just policy innovations, Simon?
No, just a small question for me to answer, huh?
Exactly, but I know you love it.
The answer to this is that there are many answers. There's no one adaptation. The point about transnational governance, Earth governance, and all the rest of it, most of those discussions accept the assumption that we have to operate in terms of the Anthropocene, recognizing that we live in a single interconnected system. Now, how we manage it, how we think about it, is done differently in all of those literatures that you refer to. But that basic assumption about living in one interconnected, complex world is, I think, the one that's absolutely crucial to this. And understanding that borders are an artifact of a larger system, they're not the given, taken, ontological category of our existence, I think is absolutely crucial. Difficult though that is to do in present circumstances where talking about borders is so much of the whole populist vocabulary. There are some things that are very obvious that really do need to be tackled. That's the whole point of my book Pyromania, is to recognize we have to come to terms with reducing the amount of fossil fuels that we burn. We have to disconnect our understanding of energy, which we need to live well, from the fuel that we are burning to get it, which is causing the problem. I like to remind people that, we academics don't like to use four-letter words, but there is one four-letter word that we have to confront, the one that starts with FU. FUEL, fuel, is the problem we have to explicitly and directly confront. We have to stop burning it, and we have to figure out how to supply our cities and everybody else, but we are a majority urban civilization now, with the energy we need to live well, without burning stuff to generate it. And of course, this is the whole point about clean energy, supposedly. The problem is fossil fuel has to be phased out. And all policies from any part of government or corporation in whatever jurisdiction that move to reduce the use of fossil fuels is job one. And regardless of whether you're talking about transnational or earth governance or whatever, that's one technology that really does need to be phased out. And the faster we can do it, the easier it's going to be for future generations. And that's true right across the world. Finding ways to provide energy for people in numerous different parts of the world. Mostly it comes down to electricity, because I like to remind people that the irony is that the slogan we need for the present circumstances comes from, of all people, Ronald Reagan, who back before he was a politician used to be a pitchman for all sorts of electrical kitchen gizmos and gadgets for various corporations. And he used to use the phrase living better electrically. We need to think about energy, and mostly the clean energy that we need is in fact electricity. That's one crucial technology, and that, of course, runs across innovations in every quarter of our world and every part of our society. The necessity of getting off carbon dioxide polluting vehicles and moving to electric vehicles. And please emphasize the trucks that move all the stuff that we need, not just the cars. The big vehicles that are increasingly now using battery power rather than diesel are a big step in the right direction. We also, of course, could reduce the amount of stuff that we use by being much more efficient with how we produce things and tackling planned obsolescence in the production of consumer goods would help greatly too. That's a matter of industrial standards, not a matter of border controls, unless, of course, the industrial standards are used as a way of preventing the imports of really shoddy goods that cause waste problems down the line. Therein again, borders and jurisdiction matter in terms of changing trading practices and reducing environmental impacts. If you can actually put carbon tariffs or other kinds of controls on the quality of what gets shipped across borders. All of these things matter. Coordinating them is never going to be easy, but all of these things need to be worked on simultaneously.
Thank you, Simon. We arrive at the end of our podcast, at the end of the second part of our podcast. You just said, you insisted on it in your book, Pyromania, you have explored a world shaped by combustions, and you have proposed some ideas in order to get out this society shaped by fuel. Um, in a nutshell, if you could answer in 3 points, 3 important main points, if you want, what would a future without reliance and combustion look like, and what steps could humans take to achieve it?
Well, I mean, the first and most obvious point is the one I've just made in terms of living better electrically, moving from combustion-based technologies to electricity generated by all sorts of new technologies which are emerging rapidly. What is notable in the last couple of decades is the rapid speed at which the price of solar panels and windmills has come down, so that electrical generation using those technologies is now, if not competitive, certainly very close to competitive in many jurisdictions, and probably most of the rest of them it will soon be. Yes, it doesn't work. Solar power doesn't work well in Whitehorse in January. I get it. But the point is that for most parts of the world, those renewable technologies are coming quickly because the price is dropping on them rapidly. Ironically, it's always the wrong time to buy a solar panel, because if you wait a couple of months, it'll be cheaper. But the point is that that is the first and obvious thing to do. Second, the industrial production systems and also the buildings that we build have to be built much more efficiently. Heat pumps are a great idea. They definitely reduce the amount of energy needed to heat and to cool buildings, making people safer, but also improving their budgets. But the back end of this is if you build buildings that don't need to be heated and cooled because they are designed to be far more energy efficient and deal with extreme conditions. If you design them well, you don't need energy to cool them and heat them in the first place. So really good design of buildings and for that matter industrial production systems that don't waste energy is a big second that we clearly need to do. And thinking through transportation, of course, is fundamental. What do we really actually need to move around? Back in the day when many of these ideas were first being thought about 50 years ago. Fritz Schumacher, in his famous book Small is Beautiful, had an epiphany when he was standing on the side of a motorway in England, and he realized that there were trucks going from London to Edinburgh and Glasgow carrying biscuits, as the British call them, cookies as North Americans do. But he also then realized that there were trucks going from Glasgow and Edinburgh down to London carrying nearly identical commodities. And he was stopping on the side of the highway thinking, this is nuts. They're virtually identical commodities, but we've got this huge amount of energy, this huge infrastructure to move these things from Glasgow to London and London to Glasgow, and they're basically indistinguishable. This is not a rational way of organizing any kind of civilization, but it has huge climate impacts. The concrete and the fuel needed to, in those days, move those, as they would have been called in England, lorries, is the kind of system that we have built that makes little sense. So stopping and thinking much more carefully about how we organized economies and the political administration of those economies is simply unavoidable. I mean, this is the task for the social scientists. We've talked about the energy engineers, we've talked about the architects and the builders. Now we've got to talk also about the social scientists. How do you design systems that allow people to live well without using massive amounts of transportation, moving huge amounts of stuff? This is what we really, as social scientists, need to stop and think about. All of those require us to understand the context of a rapidly changing world, which will require us to think about how to make stuff, quite literally what we produce, how we produce it, but produce it in ways that makes us much less vulnerable to the disruptions that are inevitably coming, but simultaneously doesn't aggravate the causes of those disruptions. That's a tall order, But that's the big questions that we all need to grapple with. And border scholars, as well as everybody else, need to pitch in and start to think about how to, as I like to say, live better without burning stuff to do so.
Thank you, Simon. In our discussion, we could realize that we are facing very complicated challenges because we have seen numbers of millions of users of airplane transportation, as you mentioned, but also of mobile phones, of global applications to receive objects the day after the command. So it's difficult to see a future without fuel and without combustions close very next week or for next month or for next year. So what do you think about this dilemma? It's a very complicated dilemma.
You want a simple world, I'd suggest you find yourself another planet to go live on, Ben. These are complicated, they are difficult, but they are the world we live in, and they are the challenges that face all of us. I mean, some of the technical innovations are simple, providing things like paths for e-bikes, making that kind of infrastructure much more immediately and obviously accessible is crucial. But at the same time, we need to think about how we design our cities so that we use less stuff to live well. In terms of the immediate delivery of whatever gizmos and gadgets we think our lives are must have today, or it'll be personally disastrous. I mean, this instant gratification culture is also inevitably part of the problem. But if we have much more robust, long-lasting, reliable gizmos and gadgets, then we don't need to order new ones on such a regular basis. I'm horrified by the sheer amount of packaging involved with Amazon, for instance. Forests are getting decimated to provide the boxes that all of us end up inevitably having our lives surrounded by. And I think we need to stop and think much more carefully about disposable items, as well as thinking about what it is that we actually need to live well. Obviously, the inequities in our society aggravate this with status consumption. Actually, I'm sorry, but Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk don't need private jets. They don't need multiple vehicles either. We need to stop and think about equity and dealing with the luxury consumption, which of course is making everything even worse, both because it's making use of all sorts of resources to build things like private jets, but it's also making lots of other people aspire to the fact that this supposedly is the good life, which brings us back to far more fundamental philosophical questions about how it is that we earthlings ought to live, and to what purpose.
Thank you, Simon. I understood now that humans have to be more critic, more responsible, not only followers of new modes of new consumerism, but it's old questions developed in the 50s too. But finally, we need to change our habits. We need to think differently, to change our habits and to influence the new policies about the design of the future of the cities or the transportations, etc. So my last question, Simon. In 2024, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that Switzerland's insufficient climate protections violated human rights. How does this decision reshape our understanding of state responsibilities in managing climate-driven migration and environmental security? And it's my last question.
I think that this kind of legal finding is most encouraging. The one that was on my mind a little while ago was a Dutch court that basically some youthful activists basically demanded that the court insist that the government actually do much more about climate change. This European Court of Human Rights ruling is in the same line, where the legal communities are starting to try to put pressure on governments to actually do the right thing in terms of making a livable future for future generations. And I think that the crucial point in all this is that point about future generations. What is the responsibility of states to their youthful citizens? We tend to think about human rights in terms of adults having legal rights. Child rights and children's rights are often focused on, the provision of food and the non-use of violence and coercion on them and those kinds of practical things, which is all good. All kids should be able to live safely, obviously. But if they're going to live safely as adults, then the long-term provision of what they need to live a good life should be part of state responsibilities. The assumption built into modernity and the whole capitalist marketing system that drives our consumption culture is that more stuff necessarily produces a better life.
Yeah.
Economic growth is supposed to be the sine qua non for progress. With progress comes the extension of effective rights. Mm-hmm. In terms of what rights to the future might actually look like, that assumption simply doesn't hold in a world where a massive increase of consumption is simply not ecologically sustainable. Mm-hmm. And gradually, people in financial institutions, and here in the case you talk about in terms of law, are beginning to grapple with the fundamental assumption of our culture that growth is necessarily good because it supposedly provides more welfare, and therefore more growth will make for better worlds for our children and grandchildren. That assumption is beginning to be undercut by legal cases like this, where it's quite clear that the present trajectories are actually going to put in question rights which our generation takes for granted. And then we have got to get into the big questions about time and sustainability, and how rights need to be available not just now, but secured into the future. Because, of course, any sensible notion of security is about providing the conditions for future life, not just present welfare. And I think that the, court cases like this are beginning to take the future seriously as a legal precept that has to be worked into governance. And it can't be assumed that simply more economic growth is going to necessarily provide a better life, and hence the facilities to ensure the rights of people in future. That's a profound change. A change which I would argue is long overdue, because many of the lessons of the 20th century were hinting at the need to take that really seriously. So the future configuration of the planet has to be worked into how we now think about rights and what we think about the responsibilities of governance. And governments have been very, very slow to take those responsibilities seriously, preferring simply to facilitate economic growth, regardless of the future consequences of it. And one of the problems that everybody keeps talking about in terms of electoral politics is the short time horizons. What's been very interesting in Canadian politics in the last little while is that at least some of that discussion has snuck into the language of the Carney government. How far we will be able to move this ahead remains to be seen. In British Columbia, the basic abandonment of any serious climate policies is a step clearly in the wrong direction. Whether there will be some bright young legal students in the law school in UVic or somewhere else that will begin to think about cases along these lines to take the EB government on, that's a really interesting question, because the abandonment of promises about climate climate is something that in this jurisdiction is clearly is something that I think will have obviously the attention of the generation that are of people that are currently students in our classrooms.
Thank you very much, Simon Dalby, for this conversation about the complex relations between borders and climate change. It was an intense discussion about some issues and some future scenarios. So thank you very much for having accepted this invitation. This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.